Hi, I'm Chuck Yost, the Chronic Waste and Disease Coordinator for the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency. Welcome to the TWRA and the University of Tennessee Extension CWD seminar. I will serve as facilitator. TWRA, UT Extension, and our partners are committed to this issue. At this time, TWRA is the lead agency since CWD is only known to be impacting wild deer, or whitetail deer, in the state, and it is the responsibility of TWRA for the management of these animals. We desire to partner with hunters, landowners, meat processors, and other agency stakeholders on this issue. This cooperation is essential to achieving our goals of preventing CWD from spreading and decreasing the prevalence where it exists. CWD threatens Tennessee's whitetail deer and elk populations and its hunting culture. Limiting its impacts depends on everyone doing their part to help out. It is very unfortunate it is here, and even though it is not known to infect humans, it is negatively impacting many Tennessee citizens in one way or another, specifically hunters, landowners, land managers, taxidermists, and meat processors in the affected area. Over the next few minutes, we will help you better understand chronic wasting disease and the CDC's recommendations regarding this subject. Then we will share what we know about CWD in Tennessee, including information on new regulations to support management. Lastly, we will inform you on how hunters can help, explore sampling options for hunters, and recommend ways to learn more about CWD. Dr. Dan Grove, an Extension Wildlife Health Specialist and Wildlife Veterinarian for the UT Extension, will now share information on CWD and CDC recommendations. Once Dr. Grove is finished, I will share about CWD in Tennessee and how hunters can help with CWD management.
So we're going to talk to you a little bit about chronic wasting disease basics, and we'll give you some of the recommendations from the CDC about how to handle your animals, as well as what to do if you're hunting in a CWD endemic zone. So first off, we'll start off with what is CWD? So chronic wasting disease is one of a group of diseases known as transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. And basically, what does that mean? It's a fatal neurologic disease. So once the prion gets into the brain, it actually causes irreversible damage. And the prion is actually basically just a misfolded protein that actually acts as an infectious agent. There's some other prion diseases out there. Most commonly, people have heard about mad cow disease in cattle. Scrapie is the disease in sheep and goats, and CJD is the disease in people. It is not known that CWD actually causes disease in humans at this point in time. There's been no known cases. In terms of our susceptible species, here in the state of Tennessee, it's going to be our white-tailed deer and our elk. Other animals out west, such as mule deer and moose, have been infected naturally in the wild. It has been shown that black-tailed deer can also be infected, and caribou have also been shown to be able to be infected. In terms of our domestic species, cattle, sheep, and goats and horses, they're not known to actually be able to get CWD from a wild animal. So where has the disease been found? So far, at this point in time, it's been identified in 26 U.S. states, 3 Canadian provinces, naturally occurring in Norway and Finland in moose and caribou populations, and it was translocated to South Korea through movement of captive cervids. So if we look at our map, it kind of gives you an idea. This is Colorado-Wyoming border. The dark gray areas are actually the areas where it was first identified prior to 2000, and the other gray areas are the counties where it's spread to since. The red and the yellow dots indicate captive cervid facilities that were known to have the disease. The red dots happen to be the ones that were depopulated, and the yellow dots are the ones that are still functioning. So if we look down here in Tennessee and Mississippi border, it kind of gives us an idea of which counties are affected. So where are the prions found within the animal? That's one of the biggest questions that we get. It's most prevalent in our neurologic tissue. It's going to be found in the brain and the spinal cord in the heaviest concentrations, and then in peripheral nerves in lower concentrations. It's been determined to be in pretty much every bodily fluid or excretion that the animal has, and that includes saliva, urine, feces, and blood. Other tissues have been looked at, your muscle and your spleen and kidneys, and it's in high concentrations in lymph nodes. And those are actually the tissues that we would use, lymph nodes and brain, for testing for the disease. So what are our signs of chronic wasting disease? It takes upwards of 10 to 18 months before we actually start seeing clinical signs as a result of the disease. Initially, you'll start to see a poor appearance of the animal. They'll have a thin, poor hair coat. Later on, in the final stages of the disease, they'll actually start drooling or stumbling, and even walking in circles. And oftentimes, you might see them laying down where they're urinating and defecating on themselves, and they're very approachable. And oftentimes, people associate it with they act like they're blind because you can walk right up to them and they don't do anything. So we're going to give a quick pop quiz here. Of these two animals that you see here, you can kind of see this one's thin, poor hair coat, and this is a nice, fat, healthy buck that we've got going on here. Which one of these animals do you think has chronic wasting disease or could potentially have chronic wasting disease? And their answer is both could actually have CWD. Because remember, the signs don't actually appear as soon as the animal becomes infected. It takes upwards of 10 to 18 months post-infection to actually show these clinical signs that we're talking about. So the animal can be out there in the landscape and be plump and healthy and look as normal as any other deer that you've ever seen and actually be infected. And it's actually more common that when we are doing our hunter-harvested surveillance and testing that the animals appear clinically healthy as reported by the hunters. So the disease is slowly progressive. It's 100% fatal. There is no known immunity, and there's been some discussion as of late with regards to resistance. So resistance is not the same as immunity. Resistance basically means the animals will still get infected and can still shed the prions. It just takes longer for those animals to actually succumb to the disease, show clinical signs, and then actually die. So that 10 to 18 months might be extended from 18 to 36 months or even longer depending on the particular animal. These kind of animals that, about 5% of the population that might express these resistance genes are actually worse because they provide environmental contamination. And the environmental contamination, we can't clean that up at this point in time. And there's no known treatment or practical vaccine for the disease. There's been a lot of work done with vaccines. It's just none of them are able to be used in wild populations at this point in time. And there's some that have actually made the disease more infectious as a result of being vaccinated. So one of the big questions is, how do animals become infected with prion? Most likely it's through contact with infectious materials such as saliva, urine, or feces that have been deposited in the environment. And it's more likely it's through consumption of those prions. The animal could also potentially get it in utero, so basically from the doe to the fawn whenever it's in the womb, or it could be right at birth, because if the doe is infected, she cleans the fawn up right after the fawn is born and could pass the prions at that point in time. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter if it was in utero or at birth, because if the fawn becomes infected early on in life, it's probably not going to survive till adulthood and then become a reproducing member of the population. Some of our environmental risks are areas where animals congregate. Because it is shed in the urine and feces and saliva and things like that, shared feed sites, rubs or scrapes, mineral licks, places like that, whether those are natural licks or artificial lick sites. These are all places where animals, if they're depositing prions into the environment, other animals may come along and be able to be infected by those prions in the environment. Unfortunately, the studies have shown that up to 15 years later, animals are still being infected in areas that are known to have environmental prion contamination. Other things that play a role, there are certain soil types that have been identified that actually make the prion more infectious. And so animals are more likely to become infected if the prion binds to certain soil types. And that's, unfortunately, makes it even worse for environmental contamination. Some of our other risk factors that we're looking at, movement of live deer and elk. It poses a significant risk of spreading CWD. And this would be man-assisted movement as well as actual natural movement of the animals as they move from state to state. Animals don't recognize borders. Whether the movement is through captive cervid industry or through reintroduction efforts that wildlife agencies are doing, if you're moving infected animals, you're moving the disease with those animals. Some of the other risk factors that we have to look at that we can actually physically control is improper disposal of carcasses, including those being brought in from other states. And so the carcass itself has a high level of prions in it if it is an infected animal, and if that's deposited on the landscape, those prions will be on the landscape for a long period of time. Now, the prions don't actually reproduce in the environment, but just the fact that they're deposited in the environment creates a potential for an animal to come along and be exposed to those. Another thing that we have to look at that we have a mechanism of controlling is the use of natural deer lures. There is the potential that these natural lures that are derived from deer urine and might potentially be contaminated with saliva and feces. And we do know that all of these fluids and bodily secretions actually carry the prion. So continued use of these in the environment is something that could lead to spreading the disease if the urine lure was infected with CWD. One of the biggest questions that we get, is it safe to eat an animal infected with CWD? Unfortunately, there's conflicting studies out there, and there's quite a few studies that are still ongoing that have not been published yet that are indicating that there is a potential. But the reality is that there has not been a single documented case of a human becoming infected with CWD. The disease has been on the landscape in Colorado and Wyoming since the late 60s. And at the level of which it is in other states, where it's almost approaching 50% prevalence in some areas, there's been a lot of people that have eaten a lot of infected meat, and there's not been a documented case of human infection from any of these people. According to the CDC, there have been no reported cases of people being infected by CWD. Wildlife agencies and wildlife professionals are not human health experts, so we would defer to the CDC for their recommendations when it comes to human health. And the CDC urges caution because the jury is still out as to whether it could be infectious to people or not. They recommend strongly considering having your deer or elk tested for CWD if you're harvesting an animal in an area known to have CWD. If your animal tests positive for CWD, they don't recommend that you eat meat from that animal. Some of the other ways that you can protect yourself, and these are actually just basic guidelines for any potential disease because you are harvesting a wild animal. Wear gloves when you're field dressing the animal. Limit the amount of time that you actually spend handling the organs of the animal whenever you're gutting the animal. And don't use your regular household knives or utensils to dress the animal out. Some additional recommendations are thoroughly wash your hands after you have handled a wild animal. Clean your knives and other tools that were used to process deer or elk. The general recommendations are take 1 part of household bleach and 1 part water, soak it in that solution for 10 minutes, rinse it off, and allow it to air dry. So the big question that we get asked, how can CWD affect deer populations? What's been seen in other states and other areas of the country that have had the disease for quite some time? You're starting to see a shift in the age structure. There's less and less older animals on the landscape, and does may only have 1 fawn before they succumb to the disease. Often fawns that are born to does have poor survival rates, and that's either because they become infected early on themselves or the doe dies before they're actually mature enough to survive on their own. In the areas where they have seen population declines, and sometimes it's upwards of 40% in a given area, there's not any sign of recovery. Does that mean you still can't grow deer in the face of the disease? You can actually still grow deer and have a thriving population in the face of the disease. It all depends on the habitat's carrying capacity. But the real problem becomes is the disease, if left unchecked and unmanaged, will continue to rise in prevalence in the population. When that happens, you'll reach a prevalence where you can no longer grow deer in the face of the disease. And so ultimately, it all depends on what your carrying capacity and your habitat quality is for your animals, whether or not and how quickly you'll actually see changes as a result of the disease. Remember, it is a slowly progressive disease. And in much the same way, it slowly progresses through the population as much as it does in an individual animal. And so we're looking at long-term scale whenever we're looking at managing these diseases.
Thank you, Dr. Grove. I will now talk about CWD in Tennessee and how hunters can help. TWRA started CWD surveillance in 2002. On December 14, 2018, TWRA was informed that 10 deer harvested in Hardeman and Fayette counties tested positive for CWD. The numbers on the map indicate those 10 positives. The source and timing of the introduction of CWD is unknown. As a result of those initial detections, TWRA increased its sampling in the affected area. And as of March 1st, we have results of 186 deer from the area testing positive for CWD. As a result of the monitoring efforts in the affected area, chronic wasting disease was also found in Madison County, increasing the number of positive counties to 3. Other counties are also affected. We refer to these as high-risk counties. These are counties where chronic wasting disease has not been detected in the county. However, it has been detected within 10 miles of its border. These high-risk counties include Chester, Haywood, McNairy, Shelby, and Tipton counties. Cumulatively, the affected area includes the positive counties of Fayette, Hardeman, and Madison, and high-risk counties of Chester, Haywood, McNairy, Shelby, and Tipton. There are new regulations to support proactive CWD management in the area. These include carcass exportation restrictions, wildlife feeding restrictions, and specialized bag limits and season dates to be determined. How can hunters help? Ways that hunters can help is to continue hunting and keep the hunting traditions alive, to honor the carcass importation restrictions if hunting out of state, use synthetic deer and elk lures instead of natural ones, and hunters in CWD positive and high-risk counties, harvest your bag limit and provide deer for sampling, and be sure and abide by the wildlife feeding and carcass exportation restrictions. We encourage using best practices for carcass disposal. You could leave the unused animal parts at the harvest location, preferably buried, or bag and landfill those parts. You could also use a meat processor, which will take care of disposal for you. Lastly, we recommend reporting sick or abnormal acting deer and elk to TWRA. In regards to CWD testing, in accordance with the CDC, when hunting in positive and high-risk counties, strongly consider having your deer tested for CWD before you eat the meat. If the animal tests positive for CWD, do not eat meat from that animal. There are various opportunities for CWD testing. These include sampling drop-off locations, participating processors and taxidermists, or staff check stations as advertised. Information on sampling locations and how to learn the results of those tests, see CWDintennessee.com. For more information on chronic wasting disease, we recommend the following agencies' websites: TWRA, the National Wildlife Health Center, the Centers for Disease Control, and USDA. Thank you for your attention regarding this important matter. We hope you found this seminar to be informative and you will do your part to aid in efforts to best manage chronic wasting disease. It requires a long-term, sustained effort with results not to be realized for quite some time. But with your help, we will successfully best manage chronic wasting disease.